I am Rachel, and I am 32 years old. I stood before my parents' lavish Hamptons estate during the Emerald Gala, wearing the silk black dress my mother once called Wall Street elegant. In my clutch was a $52,000 sponsorship check, a payment I had authorized to fund this very night. I arrived exactly on time, but the receptionist's words sliced through me like a cold blade. I am sorry, your name is not on the guest list. I froze as my father, Michael, stepped into the light. He did not see a daughter, he saw an embarrassment. Escort this beggar out, he told security. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. The rain in the Hamptons is cold, but it was nothing compared to the ice in my father's voice when he called me a beggar. I walked to my car with a steady stride, the heels of my designer shoes clicking against the wet pavement in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. I didn't fumble for a tissue to wipe away tears that weren't there. I didn't stop to look back at the glowing windows of the estate where the orchestra was playing a waltz funded by my own sweat and labor. I simply sat in the driver's seat and let the silence of the cabin settle around me. For 10 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, but tonight, the board of directors had reached a unanimous decision. The dividend payments were over. I pulled my laptop from my bag. The screen's glow was clinical, cutting through the shadows of the car like a scalpel. I didn't feel rage. Anger is loud and messy, and what I felt was quiet, precise, and entirely analytical. I was looking at a balance sheet that had been in the red for far too long. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and it was time to settle the account. I logged into my company's internal finance portal. First item, sponsorship for the Emerald Gala. The system prompted me for a reason for the revocation. I typed, beneficiary no longer meets the ethical standards of the guarantor. With one click, $52,000 was pulled back from the hotel's accounts. I could almost hear the music stop. Next, I opened my personal banking app. There it was, the supplementary credit card I provided for my mother, Jennifer. She used it to maintain the illusion of a woman who belonged in the front row of every high fashion show. The current balance was climbing toward $30,000. I didn't call her to warn her, and I didn't send a text. I simply selected the account and hit terminate. Access revoked. Finally, I moved to the largest liability, the financial guarantee for my brother Nicholas's residence. $150,000 held in escrow to ensure his luxury lifestyle remained uninterrupted while he played at being an entrepreneur. I submitted the request to the bank partner to withdraw the guarantee immediately. In less than 3 minutes, I had revoked $680,000 worth of support. It wasn't revenge, it was simple accounting. I was returning to them the very thing they had demanded when they threw me out: their freedom. They were now free to live their lives without the burden of my presence, and more importantly, without the burden of my money. I closed the laptop and leaned my head back against the seat. I breathed in the scent of the leather and the rain, feeling a lightness in my chest that no amount of family approval could ever buy. I wasn't the daughter they wanted, but I was finally the woman I needed to be. The subscription to my life had been canceled, and for the first time in 32 years, I was no longer footing the bill. I sat in the car, the windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. For 10 years, I had been the architect of a life I wasn't allowed to inhabit. I looked at the mental ledger of the $680,000 I had just reclaimed. It wasn't a sudden impulse. It was the final entry in a decade-long record of neglect. I remembered the first time I stepped in to save them. It was a $40,000 hospital bill for my father's emergency surgery. I was 22, working 3 jobs and skipping meals, but I wired the money without a second thought. My mother's only response was a text. The wire went through. Nicholas needs a new laptop for school too. That was the pattern. I paid for the luxury vacations to the French Riviera, but when the photos went up on social media, I was cropped out. The Miller family enjoying the sun, the captions read, featuring my parents and Nicholas grinning on a yacht I had chartered. I was the one who booked the flights and handled the insurance, but in their narrative, I was merely the busy daughter who couldn't find the time to visit. My presence was an inconvenience, but my credit limit was a family asset. My mother, Jennifer, had a way of turning my generosity into a debt. Whenever I tried to express the hurt of being excluded, she would sigh with theatrical exhaustion. "Rachel, you were always the difficult child," she would say, her eyes cold as emeralds. "You aren't perfect like Nicholas. This is your duty. It's how you show you're part of this family since you've always been so distant." I understand now that I was trapped in a prison without bars. It is what I call the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up in a house where love is conditional, you stop being a person and start being a tool. You convince yourself that if you just give a little more, or if you fix one more problem, they will finally look at you and see a daughter instead of a bank account. I lived in a state of learned helplessness, a silent cage where my only worth was my utility. I was the survivor of their emotional wreckage, and my penance was to fund their delusions of grandeur. My mother didn't see my sacrifices as a choice. She saw them as the minimum requirement for an imperfect child to remain in the shadow of their favor. I was never a member of the family. I was a subscription they had taken for granted, and I had finally let the service expire. The storm inside my car was silent, but the one on my phone was 47 missed calls deep. I watched the screen light up with Jennifer's name again. She wasn't calling to apologize for calling me a beggar, and she wasn't calling to see if I was safe in the rain. She was calling because the $30,000 limit on her supplementary card was now zero, and her facade of high society elegance was starting to crack. When I finally answered, her voice was a shriek that could have shattered the car's glass. "Rachel, what have you done? I am at the boutique with the mayor's wife, and my card was declined like I was some kind of common fraud. You have humiliated me. You are an ungrateful, cold-hearted monster. Who do you think you are to treat your mother this way?" I didn't argue. I didn't remind her that I had paid for the gold dress she was wearing, or the anniversary cake that was being sliced at that very moment. I simply said, "I didn't humiliate you, Mother. Your bank account did. If you want to maintain a luxury lifestyle, I suggest you find a guarantor who isn't a beggar." Then came Nicholas. His messages were a frantic stream of profanity and threats. The bank had already contacted him about the $150,000 guarantee I had pulled on his residence. He told me he would destroy my career. He said he would tell the board of my investment fund that I was mentally unstable and a danger to the company. He called me a traitor to the bloodline and told me I was dead to the family. There was no remorse in any of it. Not a single question about why I had walked away. They weren't mourning the loss of a daughter or a sister. They were mourning the loss of their primary revenue stream. This was the toxic reaction of people who realized their prey had finally grown teeth. In their eyes, my only role was to support the household, and by reclaiming my own life, I was committing an act of war. My father, Michael, sent the shortest message of all. "You have made a lethal mistake, Rachel. We will fix this whether you like it or not." It was the same authoritative tone he used to command his real estate deals, but it had no weight without my capital. I rubbed my eyes, not out of exhaustion, but for clarity. I wasn't the one who had destroyed the family. I was just the one who had stopped paying for the play acting. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me at the gala. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I went back to my spreadsheet. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The next morning, the neon lights of the city felt sharper and more honest. I didn't head to a spa to recover from the gala, and I didn't check into a clinic for stress. I went to the one place where facts are the only currency that matters: my law firm. Grace, my attorney, and the only person who knew the true architecture of my finances, was already waiting for me in the conference room. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She offered a thick stack of manila folders and a fountain pen that felt heavy with the weight of consequence. "Rachel, we have a lot to finalize," she said, her voice a cool, professional hum. We sat in a room that smelled of expensive ink and high-stakes decisions. I wasn't there to vent about my feelings. I was there to execute a strategy. My relationship with my family was no longer a matter of the heart. It was a matter of litigation. I told myself it wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. Grace laid out the first set of documents. We are issuing formal notices for the recovery of the $680,000 in unauthorized transfers and guaranteed funds, she explained. They have 30 days to initiate a repayment plan before we escalate to a civil suit. I watched her hand move across the paper, authorized by my signature. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long. Now I was the aggressive creditor. Then we moved to the kill shot, the Hamptons mansion. My parents had lived there for years, hosting their lavish parties and calling it the Miller family estate. But they had been arrogant enough to never check the deed. The property was held under a holding company that I controlled entirely. They were guests in a house they thought they owned. I looked at the eviction notice sitting on the table. It was cold, factual, and lethal. I authorized the 30-day notice of termination of residency. I didn't do it because I wanted to see them on the street. I did it because tolerance is a resource, and my family had depleted the reserve. I realized that compassion would never change people who only saw me as an unpaid servant or a walking wallet. As I walked out of the office, I felt a strange, metallic clarity. I had spent 32 years trying to buy their love with my silence and my success. I had been a fool to think that a contract written in blood could be honored by people who only valued gold. The professional escalation had begun, and there was no fine print they could hide behind this time. Grace sat across from me, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. She tapped a thick file on the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet office like a gavel. "Rachel, I was auditing the records for the trust fund your grandmother established for you," she began, her voice dropping into a lower, more serious register. "I found something that goes beyond mere financial mismanagement." She slid a series of bank documents across the polished wood. I looked at the withdrawals, $100,000 removed over the last 5 years, in increments that were just small enough to avoid immediate flags. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the authorization forms. It was my name, written in a cursive that mimicked my own, but the loop of the L and the tail of the Y were slightly off. It was a forgery. "Your father, Michael, used his position as a secondary contact to access these funds," Grace explained, her eyes fixed on mine. "He has been forging your signature for years to subsidize their lifestyle and keep Nicholas in designer suits." I didn't feel the world tilt. I didn't feel my heart break. Instead, I felt a strange, cold sense of completion. The last piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. They weren't just ungrateful or dismissive, they were systematic predators. They had been stealing from my future to fund their present for as long as I could remember. This wasn't family business anymore. This was a crime. For 10 years, I had worried that I was the problem, or that I was the one who was too distant or too difficult to love. But looking at those forged signatures, I realized I was just a victim of a very long, very professional con. They didn't love me, but they certainly loved the access my name provided to a grandmother's legacy they hadn't earned. I leaned back and looked at Grace. I didn't ask if we should call them, and I didn't ask if we could work it out. This wasn't an emotional crisis, it was an audit, and the audit showed that my family was morally bankrupt. I closed the folder with a sharp snap. "There is no path to redemption for this," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "They stripped away the role of daughter a long time ago. Now, I am just the person who holds the evidence of their crimes." Michael and Jennifer weren't shocked by their own cruelty at the gala. They were just terrified I would eventually look in this folder. The criminal twist was the final kill shot. It removed any remaining illusion that blood meant anything more than a common DNA sequence. They are no longer my family. They are just defendants in a case I am going to win. The glass doors of my office opened with a force that spoke of desperation, not authority. Michael led the way, his face a mask of practiced indignation, while Jennifer hovered behind him. her hands trembling as she clutched a designer bag that was now a relic of a life they could no longer afford. Nicholas followed, his usual smugness replaced by the raw panic of someone whose safety net had just been shredded. "Rachel, this has gone far enough," Michael barked, trying to summon the ghost of his former power. "You will reinstate the fund guarantees and unblock your mother's accounts immediately. We are your family, and you are destroying our reputation." I didn't stand up, and I didn't even look up from the tablet in my hand until the silence in the room became unbearable. I slid a single manila folder across the mahogany desk. "Reputation is a curious thing, Michael," I said, my voice like dry ice. "It is built on perception, but it is destroyed by facts. Open the folder." I watched his eyes scan the forged signatures. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking old and diminished in his tailored suit. Jennifer peered over his shoulder, her breath catching in a small, pathetic gasp. $100,000, I continued, each number precise, forged authorizations, charity fraud from the church hardship fund. It is all there. The transition from predator to prey was instantaneous. Jennifer sank into the chair she hadn't been invited to, her eyes red and pleading. "Rachel, please. We were just trying to keep things afloat. We did it for all of us. You have so much, you wouldn't have even missed it." Michael's voice cracked, the authority gone. "Don't do this. We will lose everything. Your brother's future." I looked at them and realized that their power had always been an illusion. They had mistaken having for being. They thought the luxury cars, the Hamptons mansion, and the front row seats made them superior, but those were just props they had rented with my money. Now that the wallet was empty, their true character was revealed. They were small, hollow, and fragile. Their authority was not a part of who they were. It was just a subscription they could no longer pay for. When the money disappeared, the person behind the wealth turned out to be a stranger with no internal value to stand on. I placed a second document on top of the evidence. "This is a copy of the eviction notice for the Hamptons estate," I said, "and this is a settlement agreement. You will return the $100,000 you stole, and you will sign over any remaining interest in the family property to my foundation." Nicholas stepped forward, his voice a desperate whine. "But where are we supposed to go?" I looked him in the eye, the same way Michael had looked at me at the gala. "You are strong, Nicholas." I echoed the words they had used to dismiss me for years. "I'm sure you will figure it out." I turned my chair back toward the window, ending the meeting without a goodbye. The power flip was complete. I wasn't their bank anymore. I was their judgment. I sold the Hamptons estate within 30 days of that final meeting. I didn't care about the market value or the bidding wars. I wanted the history of it erased, the echoes of those gold-plated parties silenced forever. When the final papers were signed and the keys were handed to a family who actually seemed to like each other, I felt a weight vanish from my shoulders that I had been carrying for 27 years. The $680,000 I reclaimed, along with the proceeds from the sale, became the seed for something real. I established the Sapphire Legacy Fund, a foundation dedicated to providing financial literacy and legal protection for people who have been victims of financial abuse within their own families. It is not a charity of pity, it is an investment in freedom. I spent a decade as an unpaid servant to a household that saw me as a shadow, and now I am using that experience to ensure others don't have to stay in the dark. The Emerald Gala is a distant memory now, a hollow spectacle of a life I no longer inhabit. I heard through the legal grapevine that Michael and Jennifer moved into a small, 2-bedroom apartment near the city, their emerald life reduced to a landscape of past due notices and diminished expectations. Nicholas is learning the hard lesson that a golden boy has no value in a world that requires a real work ethic. They weren't bad people because they were poor. They were empty because they had spent their entire lives pretending that having money was the same thing as having a soul. I stand on the balcony of my new office in Austin, watching the city breathe below me. The air is clean, and for the first time in my life, the silence is not heavy with the expectation of a phone call asking for money. I have learned that forgiveness is not a gift you give to those who hurt you. It is the act of refusing to carry their rage forward. I no longer need to be chosen by them because I have finally chosen myself. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the invisible one, like you were the stagehand in someone else's perfect production, I want to say this to you directly. You are not a burden, and your worth is not a formula based on how much you can give. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect your own heart from those who only value your utility. Family is where you are seen and respected. And if you cannot find that in your bloodline, you have every right to build your own empire elsewhere. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story touched a nerve, please share it with someone who needs the courage to set their own boundaries. Don't forget to subscribe so we can continue these journeys of healing and justice together. Remember, the bravest thing you will ever do is dare to be the one who walks away from the table when love is no longer being served.